Thank you, Barry. That was a very hard act to follow. So I'm going to try as the second last speaker for the afternoon to be as engaging as I can, but I do understand that it's been a long day, so I'll forgive you for snoring, but just don't do it too loudly while I'm speaking. I want to speak about the intersection between law, religion, and social stability. And my thesis for today's topic is really going to be this issue of how do we move from religious freedoms to social stabilities? And particularly, what is the role and what are the responsibilities of religious organizations and communities? And I will do that particularly having regard to the organization that I work for, and speaking about what kind of work we do, why we do it, and whether or not that actually assists in that ultimate goal of enabling social stability or not. We heard throughout the day today, I think, a bunch of different ideas and definitions of social stability. I'm not going to focus on what I call external stability. So in my mind, social stability can take two forms. It can be internal or external. External being national issues related to security, safety, those types of things. And internal really referring specifically to issues related to social harmony. How do we as individuals and as communities build a better, stronger society so that ultimately we're able to deal with national threats? And in my view, religious communities, while they have continued to play an important role over the years, have come to a place where we have to actually reconsider the roles we've played and decide whether we are prepared to go that extra mile. And that extra mile that I want to speak about is really stepping outside of our silos in such a way that we are actually not just representing and defending those interests that we're comfortable with. In other words, looking at the other as somebody who I can potentially tolerate and therefore I'll respect their right to wear a hijab or something else, but rather stepping forward from that tolerance to an acceptance to the point where we're prepared to recognize that that otherness may sometimes actually challenge our very question of right and wrong. And how far are we prepared to go forward even where their otherness may defy or may challenge our values and our views of what is right or wrong morally. And that's the direction in which I think Barry's speaking about to some degree on the Trinity Western issue. But I'm going to speak about it in a larger context within Canadian jurisprudence and the role that the World Sikh Organization has played in that. I think I have to begin first by perhaps giving you a little bit of an introduction. Really, who is the World Sikh Organization, and I suppose who are the Sikhs? Because I think that's an important piece of this component when you begin to look at the kind of work we're doing and why we do it. Sikhism, as many of you may know, is the 5th largest religion in the world. At least 22 million followers around the world, majority of which reside in India. And then there are large communities in the diaspora, primarily in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So in Canada, approximately 500,000 Sikhs reside there. And that relates to about 1.6% of the Canadian population, which interestingly is actually very close to the proportion that they represent in India as well, which is about 2% of the total population in India. The World Sikh Organization is a human rights advocacy group, and we were founded in 1984 in North America to represent the interests of the Sikh diaspora. And one would think that when we speak about the interests of the Sikh diaspora, that may in fact have a very narrow definition, but the WSO has really taken that in the broadest possible sense of the word to really relate to the interests of any individual that is affected in a way or discriminated in a way as a result of their own religious beliefs. And that comes from a basic value in Sikhism, which is really the principles of the faith itself. Sikhism was founded in the late 1400s by Guru Nanak, and it was really a religion that was founded to challenge the social structures of the day. Guru Nanak perceived the world and certainly society around him as being intrinsically in disrepair primarily because of religious conflict, and felt that religions were in fact playing a very detrimental role towards this whole idea of social stability, when in fact they should be building society. And so a large part of his impetus was to really challenge existing social mores. Whether or not it was issues related to female infanticide, which he stood up against, whether it was issues related to gender inequality, caste system, the very distinct divisions between different religions. Sikhism as a philosophy believed that every single religion is a pathway ultimately to the same goal. That whether you're a Sikh, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, if you're true to your own faith, then you will ultimately reach the same goal. And for a Sikh, that goal is important because I think it'll resonate for each of you that comes from different faith communities. But ultimately, the goal for a Sikh, spiritual goal, we view is simply conscious union with our divine source. And so we believe that the way to have this conscious union with our divine source is to really act in a godlike way. And so how does one behave in a godlike way, or in a way which represents and reflects this creative harmony? And the way that Guru Nanak approached this was that he began with this premise that all dissension in society is caused really by by duality, this sense of me and not me. So this idea that this whole world is created of two types of entities. There's I, which means everything to do with me, whether it's my family, whether it's my friends, my things, my belongings, and everything else outside of that is seen to be not me. And when we begin to see the world in that parsed out way, Sikhism and Guru Nanak believed that that really was where we started to create dissent. We started to create problems, because the minute I see you as the other, then your problems don't become mine. Then I'm not prepared to go that extra mile for you. I'm not prepared to step outside of my comfort zone to assist you. And so he felt that if you ended this duality, if you ended up with this concept of unity, this unity, oneness of humankind, this brotherhood of man, of woman, of society, then you would begin to be able to view the world as intrinsically connected and interconnected with each other. And if we were able to get rid of this duality, then we would be able to create a socially harmonious, socially stable society. Which is all well and good in a theoretical way, but how does one achieve that in a practical way? And so for Sikhism, the practical way was to literally walk the talk. So Guru Nanak taught, and Sikh philosophy really teaches, that if you want to create the change, then you have to be the change in a very simple, straightforward way. So how do you do that? Well, part of what you have to do is you have to be prepared to make yourself really uncomfortable, to the point of self-sacrifice. And that's partly why our 9th Sikh Guru, because Sikhism evolved over 200 years, and the final form was in 1699 with the creation of a separate Sikh identity. But the 9th Sikh Guru actually chose to be beheaded by the Mughal rulers of the day in order to defend the rights of the Hindus to freely practice their faith, because they were being forcefully converted by the ruling Mughals. And so because this Sikh Guru chose to step up, sacrifice his life for the sake of not his own faith, of his own people, but for a different people, but in his mind, those different people were still his people, because that distinction between myself and the other was no longer there. And I think when we look at the kind of work that religious communities are doing, we always have to ask ourselves that same question. Are we really simply creating further distinctions and divisions in society? Or are we actually assisting to erode those distinctions and divisions in such a way that we can build social stability? So when WSO was faced with this issue, we simply came back to the basic idea that we have a social, moral, ethical obligation to stand up for those that may differ in their views from us completely. That's why the World Sikh Organization took a step forward and defended the rights of a young Scottish boy because he wanted to wear his kilt to graduation. And he wasn't being permitted to do so because we felt that that was something that was important for this young man to express his cultural identity. Or we spoke up in support of a young woman who wanted to play soccer wearing the hijab. Or in support of a young Aboriginal boy who wanted to keep his braids in school, but the school was forcing him to remove his braids. These were issues that we were confronted with as an organization, and in each instance we had to make that decision of, do we step outside of our comfort zone? And in every instance the answer had to be yes, because that's really where our duty lies, I think, as religious organizations. So how that translated itself in the lawmaking sphere, the first intervention we had was a case called Syndicate Northcrest versus Emsalem, where Mr. Emsalem was a Orthodox Jewish man who wanted to build a sukkah hut on his balcony for 9 days of the year for a religious celebration. But the condominium complex in which he lived in Montreal barred him from doing so. They came up with all sorts of excuses, but ultimately it simply came down to they didn't like this structure that they felt was unattractive in a very rich, expensive area. And so WSO made the decision to intervene in that particular case before the Supreme Court of Canada because we felt that there were very important critical principles that needed to be outlined and needed to be addressed by the court. Although Mr. Emsalem was not a Sikh, and Jewish beliefs are different than Sikh beliefs, ultimately the belief system really sits down to the same values of making sure that we are prepared to recognize that other individuals outside of our own ethnic and religious communities need to have that added protection. And that protection is absolutely mandatory, I think, in the context of the work that religious communities do. The second case that we were involved in was a case called Multani, and Gurbaj Singh Multani was a young Sikh boy. And he was faced with an interesting dilemma. As one of the 5 articles of faith that a Sikh keeps on their person at all times once they become confirmed into the religion, that article of faith was a kirpan. And a kirpan resembles a small sword. And Gurbaj Singh Multani was confirmed into Sikhism, and he used to wear this kirpan on his body at all times. That reminds a Sikh, A, of their own mortality, but B, of their obligation and duty to defend the defenseless, to stand up for the rights of those that can't defend themselves. It's never to be used as a weapon, it's never to be used in any form, but the reality is that for an outsider who does not know what this is, it may very well look like a weapon. And so Gurbaj Singh Multani was playing on the school playground. The kirpan fell out, and he was faced with expulsion by the school because they said to him that he could only come to school without the kirpan. So that case ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in a unanimous judgment, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the religious values and principles that really went behind the kirpan and that really were the reason why Mr. Multani was wearing the kirpan and allowed it. But what was really telling, I think, and what goes back to Barry's question that he's asked, the statement that the Supreme Court of Canada made in that decision is, I think, one of the most profound and beautiful statements of not only freedom of religion, but conscience as well. What it means to be a person of faith, what it means not just necessarily to practice a religion, but to have values and beliefs and how those need to be protected. And so, Barry, although I know that you spoke about this concern about whether there's a narrowing or an attack on religious freedoms, I wonder, though, whether, in my view, really, it seems to me that they're being broadened. When people like Mr. Multani can be accepted by the Supreme Court as an individual that has rights to freely practice his faith, when that definition is broadened to include other religious communities, I don't know that there's an assault that's narrowing the definition. But I do think that what's happening is there is a dilemma in the Trinity Western case, and that dilemma falls full square into this issue of how far do we take religious freedoms when they directly impede or affect another community? And, as many of the lawyers in this crowd might know, we're often taught in law school that my right to swing my arm is limited when it strikes your face. And so the question really is how far are religious communities permitted to go outside of the church, outside of the synagogue or the gurdwara or the mosque, and impart either in educational institutions and have students from the public coming into those institutions, and then have rules and requirements that may offend the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or some other human rights types of legislation. And I think, to be fair, in my view, that's the dilemma that the court, or that the legal community is struggling with, and the court will have to struggle with, ultimately in Trinity Western. And I don't know that it's an assault on religion as much as it is going back to this question of viewing the relationship between religion and religious freedoms, really, and social stability. And I really liked what Marco Ventura did in his presentation this morning. He talked about sort of 4 ways to view that relationship. And the first he spoke about was religious freedom is a threat to social stability, or perhaps number 2, that social stability is a threat to religious freedom. Or he said that potentially number 3, religious freedom is indispensable to social stability. And then 4th, that social stability may be indispensable to religious freedom. And so he gave us 4 options. I would beg to differ and say that there's a 5th option, and that 5th option is really that there is an intrinsic interconnectedness between religious freedom and social stability such that neither takes precedence over the other. Both of them require each other absolutely equally in order to build the kind of society that we want to build. And I say that because I think ultimately, if we are looking at, really advancing society to the place that Tim Wilson was speaking about this morning, a society where religious organizations and communities, I think in the 21st century, he said, need to be able to step outside and go beyond, beyond themselves in a way, and in order to be able to advance into the future. I think that's really what we're looking at, which is I cannot have my religious freedoms unless I live in a socially stable enough society that's not threatened by my presence or appearance as a Sikh. So social stability is critical to me being able to have religious freedom. But on the converse as well, religious freedom is critical because if you allow me to freely practice who I am or as I am, then ultimately society will become that much more better for it, because I will be able to participate equally, fairly, contribute to the economy of society, contribute towards building it. And so religious communities, in my view, and I think I'm running out of time, religious communities ultimately, in my view, I think, have to ask themselves the very difficult question of what do we do when the otherness of the other offends our moral values? Do we step back and say our moral values take precedence? For many Sikhs, they're against gay marriage. I don't think that you will see gay marriages occurring in the Gurdwaras, but the Sikh community was upfront in support of same-sex legislation in Canada, because we believed that even though it was uncomfortable, even though for some Sikhs it may even offend their deep moral values, there was a larger, more positive, necessary social outcome that was critical. And that was recognizing that the other ultimately is my brother or my sister, and that they have equal rights. And while I might find their behavior offensive, so long as it doesn't directly impact me or impede me in being able to conduct myself, then I really must be able to stand out and move forward and support in support of them. And so that's my premise. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.